My name is Brian Stoffer. I'm the translator here, Spanish translator at the GLO. And I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Francis X. Galan. Francis X. Galan is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University, San Antonio, where he teaches courses on Texas, Mexico, and Latin America. He received his PhD in History from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, an MA in History from UT San Antonio, and BA in Latin American Studies from UT Austin. His book, Los Adayes, The First Capital of Spanish Texas, was published in 2020 by Texas A&M University Press and won the 2022 Book Award from the Texas Old Missions and Forts Restoration Association. It was also a finalist for the 2021 Ramirez Family Award for Most Significant Scholarly Book from the Texas Institute of Letters. His main research interests are in the Hispanic roots of Texas and revolve around questions related to borders, trade, kinship, and identity. Please welcome Dr. Francis Galan.
Good afternoon. I am honored and privileged to present at this wonderful symposium. A big thanks to all the folks from the Texas General Land Office, and I might say going up at 1 o'clock right after lunch, which after all was just awesome lunch, and I don't know I presented anywhere with a better lunch. But just thinking about that, and just imagine yourself that it's the year 1724 in the spring, and you're about 40, 50 miles east of the Sabine River, and there's no food to eat. And the harvest had failed the previous season. Supplies are late from coming from San Antonio. You have the issue with flooding on one of the rivers. Even the mailman delivering from San Antonio, one of the soldiers, drowned trying to deliver the mail. And so that if you are there in that situation, what do you do? When the authorities say that you cannot trade with the Indians and the French, what are you going to do? You're going to trade. And you're going to trade whatever you can. And there was a French observer who had said around that time to his superior officer that the people are starving at Los Adayes, and that it is here where the French can make a killing in terms of trade. And so then, just keeping that perspective in mind is very important. It may be hard for many of us to believe that the first capital of Texas was not Austin or Houston or even San Antonio. And it's hard for me to think either because I am from San Antonio, so I'm partial to San Antonio. But a rather off-the-grid historic site called Los Adayes, located in northwestern Louisiana, just 12 miles due west from present Natchitoches, Louisiana, or about 70 miles south from Shreveport. Los Adayes offers a different perspective of Texas history and for understanding that national borders had colonial roots, as did problems such as smuggling that persist to the present. And I thought it very fitting that Paul Conrad was talking about persistence in the case of the Apaches, or that Folsom was talking about these flawed borders, because that's precisely what was really going on in this region. A little bit of background. Los Adayes was a presidio, or fort, the Spanish established in 1721, along with a mission located nearby, located deep in the piney woods of Texas at the end of the Camino Real, or Royal Road, about 1,200 miles distant from Mexico City. Along with other major corridors to Santa Fe and San Francisco, the Camino Real was the main highway as the silver mining frontier gradually expanded northward following Cortez's conquest over the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. However, the Spanish were unable to establish an east-west highway across northern New Spain, due largely to the mostly desert and mountainous region or terrain, not to mention resistance from indigenous peoples, which made communication, supplies, and migration even more challenging at the edges of empire. And so you could imagine with the map that Paul was talking about, showing this forced migration of Apaches south, you have this also kind of forced migration of settlers to the north even. And perhaps we can talk more about that later. But in Texas, where there was no discovery of gold or silver, The Spanish primarily sought to establish a defensive perimeter after a French threat appeared with the ill-fated voyage of La Salle and his lost colony along the Gulf of Mexico in the late 17th century. The main reason smuggling became problematic was because the Habsburg monarchy in Spain did not allow the French to trade legally through the port of Veracruz off the Gulf Coast in southeastern Mexico. The only other legal port of entry at the time would have been in Acapulco, which would go to the Manila trade. By the 1730s, after the third attempt at conquest in East Texas that included other forts and missions, the Spanish began investigations to determine a territorial boundary with Louisiana to prevent French traders from entering illegally into Texas. After interviewing local residents at Los Adayas, officials came up with the Arroyo Hondo, a tributary creek off the lower Red River about halfway between French Natchitoches and Los Adayas. Shortly thereafter, the Spanish intermittently prosecuted French traders who bypassed Los Adayas along rivers and indigenous byways that formed contraband trails through Texas. Meanwhile, the problem of deserters and fugitive slaves also arose as individuals sought opportunities and freedom on the other side of the border, such as the problem that appeared of African slaves showing up and seeking asylum inside the Spanish missions. The Texas-Louisiana borderlands was part of a chess match as the concern about smuggling grew for the Spanish with the larger threat from the British and the Georgia-Florida borderlands, as well as from the Yucatan-Belize borderlands at opposite ends of the Gulf. The irony is that the Spanish, by then, under the Bourbon monarchy of King Felipe V, or the Fifth, was the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. They entered into a so-called family compact with the French, even though the Spanish remained suspicious of traders from Louisiana. As you can hopefully tell from the map in this slide, Spanish Texas, seen within the darker shaded area, was maybe 1/5 the size of the present Lone Star State. And this map, incidentally, comes from Bolton's book published in 1915, Texas in the Middle 18th Century, which was one of my favorite secondary sources. The borders of Spanish Texas were extremely messy with so many rivers and diverse indigenous peoples. And indeed, historian Juliana Barr wrote an article, Geography of Power, published after her book, Peace Came in the Form of a Woman, was published, and argued that Indians enforced their own borders, keeping their own eye on the Spaniards as well as the French. The Spanish could draw only so many lines and provide only so many troops, while Spain remained fixated on monopolizing trade in virtually all commodities on its frontiers in New Spain and throughout the Americas, including silver, cattle, horses, tobacco, based off a mercantile economy whereby colonies existed only for the benefit of the mother country in Europe. Yet the paramount struggle for Spain was not only external threats from European competition or Indian raids, but also internal difficulties with the prohibition against its own subjects from engaging in comercio libre, or literally free trade, on the Texas frontier that often included the governors, Franciscans, military officers, rank-and-file soldiers, and other settlers. In the case of Los Adayas, vast distances from other Hispanic settlements in New Spain across volatile frontiers, harsh landscapes, the lack of sustainable harvests, and natural disasters all combined to make the scarcity of supplies more dire, and thus the need for friendly relations with the Caddo and French close by in the Texas-Louisiana borderlands. Crossing borders became vital for the Adeseños, or the settlers from Los Adayas, such that the creation of the Arroyo Hondo boundary between Texas and Louisiana had been broken from the start through a pattern of trade, kinship, and worship that predated the determination of this colonial border. The transformation of the frontier in East Texas and messy borders, you might argue, began with Louis Juzereau de Saint-Denis, a third-generation French-Canadian trader who established the post at Natchitoches, Louisiana, around 1714 under King Louis XIV. In his classic work, Spanish Texas, historian Don Chipman states that Saint-Denis became the godfather of Texas after serving as a guide for the Domingo Ramon expedition in 1716 and helping the Spanish return to East Texas. This occurred soon after Saint-Denis had married Manuela Sanchez Navarro, step-granddaughter of Captain Diego Ramon, who was the local commandant at San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande near present-day Eagle Pass, Texas. Manuela, and from my perspective, thus became the godmother of the Texas-Louisiana borderlands, an indication that she wielded power behind the scenes, as historian Amy Porter argues about women in her book, Their Lives, Their Wills. Together, Manuela and Saint-Denis had 5 children, 2 of them born at San Juan Bautista before she traveled to Natchitoches, where she bore the other 3. She and Saint-Denis became godparents to French, Spanish, Indian, and African children, thus creating both real and fictive blood ties in the region through the Catholic practice of compadrazgo, or co-parenthood. Manuela and other Spanish women acted as cultural brokers, much like indigenous women who the French took as wives in marriage or concubines. In the words of historian Robert Weedle, just as San Juan Bautista became the gateway to Texas from the Rio Grande, the same may apply to Natchitoches in the other direction from the Red River. Hence, while the Camino Real officially ended at Los Adayes, it blended into Natchitoches, where lines of trade, kinship, and worship overlapped. Meanwhile, another important person was Angelina of the Hasinai, Caddo, or Tejas Nation in East Texas, who was likely taken captive at a young age and grew up in Monclova, Coahuila. Apparently, she was baptized Catholic and learned to speak fluent Castilian Spanish in the mission near Presidio San Juan Bautista. By 1712, a French trader reported she had served as a guide and interpreter for French traders, including Saint-Denis, on their way to the Rio Grande. According to Father Isidro Felix de Espinosa, Angelina also served as interpreter for the Ramon expedition of 1716 to East Texas that reestablished the Spanish missions after the initial Spanish attempt in 1690 to 1693 had failed miserably. Ramon noted the key role Angelina played in the dedication of the East Texas missions. She had served the same role for the Martín de Alarcón expedition of 1718 that established the Presidio and mission at San Antonio de Béjar, as well as the Aguayo expedition of 1721 that reestablished the Spanish missions once again after a brief war between France and Spain broke out in Europe and forced the closure of the East Texas missions. By 1721, the Spanish decided to add the Presidio and mission of Los Adayes much closer to French Natchitoches, where Angelina also served as interpreter between the Hasinai Caddo, or recognized leader of the Tejas Hasinai nations, and the Marqués de Aguayo in solidifying peace and cooperation. And so when I think about someone like Angelina, and in teaching a course on history of Mexico, it's like, well, she's not exactly, in a way, she's like Doña Marina, but she's not really remembered necessarily as La Malinche. And so there's very interesting comparisons in terms of these roles of women. By the mid-1730s, kinship networks between Los Adayes and Natchitoches only grew as Spain sought to define the border between Texas and Louisiana. However, an important caveat to French relations, and this is extremely important, was the decision of the viceroy in Mexico City not to allow the Franciscans the use of military force to gather Indians into the East Texas missions for fear that such efforts would drive the Caddos into rebellion with French allies nearby. And as I relate in my book, there were instances of soldiers from Los Adayes and San Antonio in which they'd go out with soldiers from San Antonio along with some mission Indians acting as guides all the way to the Rio Grande. As for trade, the viceroy only allowed foodstuffs to be exchanged between the Spanish and the French. After all, who doesn't like to have a nice feast like we just had? And it appeared that the French really had the plenty across the border. But in reality, the cultural reactions that came with Catholic rituals and celebrations of baptisms and marriages also served as cover for contraband trade. And I believe it was the archaeologist Pertula who had made that observation. And there's another story behind this wedding in the spring of 1736, because the father, Joseph Gonzalez, he's the interim commander while Governor Sandoval is tending to problems in San Antonio with the Apaches, the recently arrived Canary Islanders, and other issues that, he's writing to the governor, says, you need to come back over here, because like the people están a punto de they are ready to rebel because there's a lot of turmoil going on over here. And incidentally, Gonzalez alleges he did not know that his daughter had decided to elope after Mass was celebrated at the chapel inside Los Adayas, and that she had escaped under the cover of darkness and the pine forest to Natchitoches. Well, I don't know, but I think that his wife, Gertrudis de la Cerda, also had some arrangement in that marriage as well with her counterpart, Manuela Sanchez Navarro Sandaní. But that's another story. And so then we have Spanish archival records that reveal account books for the soldiers at Los Adayas beginning in the late 1730s through the 1760s. The example on the screen here is from 1739, an entry from Mateo Ibarbo, an immigrant from Spain who was at the Presidio San Antonio de Béjar before arrival at Los Adayas, where his son, Antonio Gil Ibarbo, was born in 1729. And many of the items listed in his account are, quite naturally, for clothing, including 2 pairs of cotton socks, 8 pairs Cordován shoes, and I thought this was interesting, para hombres y mujeres. I mean, got to make sure we're reminded that there were also women settlers at this fort. It wasn't just all male. But I also thought it was, and then there's thread from Sevilla, sombreros, but also tobacco, which here is described as zacate limpio. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I have to mow the lawn and it's like, you got to water the lawn, and I always hear my relatives, it's like, estoy con el zacate enfrente, When you think about it being literally limpio, I'm going, wow, so that was clean grass? Meaning that it was probably pure grade tobacco, and that tobacco coming from or being grown in French Louisiana. But they also liked chocolate. Surprise. Soap, sugar. Other accounts might have the piloncillo, like that sugar cone that you might see at H-E-B Marketplace. And belduques, a type of short sword or curved blade. However, the soldiers at Los Adayas often did not receive supplies on a timely basis, or goods became podrido, they became rotten, so that trade with the cadeaux in French became essential. Contraband trade also became essential when soldiers were not paid their wages, for which they occasionally had to sue the governor, since he doubled as the commandant at the fort, in order to receive back pay. The governors frequently utilized soldiers as personal laborers in a pre-modern form of debt peonage, a topic historian William Kaiser discusses in his brilliant book titled Borderlands of Slavery. What followed by the 1740s was an expansion of contraband trade along trails that developed to other Hispanic settlements and missions. Here's a marker for one called Don Joaquin Crossing on Badayas Trail, which states, this trail ran from Badayas Indian camps on the lower Trinity River to Spanish missions near Nacogdoches. And I kept seeing Paso Tomas, and you'd hear reference to a Tomas who was a Baday Indian, and there's a lot of trade going on there, and it's not all legal. Interestingly, there was a contraband case from the early 1760s that involved none other than a Franciscan friar named Father Sedano, who was stopped by a patrol from Los Adayas that discovered many bundles of tobacco in the priest's cargo. And so I don't know that exactly he was following that contraband trail that just mentioned here, but it was within that region of southeastern Texas. Father Sedano claimed he had permission from the governor to bring his goods from Louisiana, and when asked specifically why the tobacco, which was grown in Louisiana, Father Sedano said it was for the Indians at Mission La Bahia, who believed it was lo mejor, like it was the best tobacco, and a way of trying to lure the Indians into the missions. However, many archival records also indicate trade between the Spanish with the Indians and French to the soldiers, acting as intermediaries along with muleteers. In this slide, we can see various so-called Indios Bárbaros. Not sure why they refer to them as Indios Bárbaros, because these were not Plains Indians, or not all of them at least, in East Texas, including the Tejas, San Pedro, Nazones, and Biday, as well as the Orcoquisas and the lower Trinity River closer to the coast. Receiving from Governor Don Jacinto de Barrios y Juaregui 2 arrobas, or 50 pounds of gunpowder, 200 pounds of ammo, knives, razors, combs, vermilion, and other goods through his soldiers. And the remaining goods included about 1,100 hides that went to Natchitoches. In this slide, an original settler of Los Adayas, Pedro de Sierra, who by the time the fort was closed in the early 70s, I mean, he was like pushing 80, okay, maybe exaggerated, maybe like 70 something, but he was an original settler, primero poblador. He testified that horses, maize, and hides were traded from Mission Nacogdoches through the governor's muleteer, Juan Antonio Maldonado, together with Sergeant Domingo Chirino to Saltillo and the neighboring province of Coahuila. So even though the Caddo Indians had not gathered into the missions, as the records bear out, and the historians have written, and commentators at the time saying there's no single Indian at the Indian, didn't mean that they didn't have some form of, if it's not careerist or voluntary labor, but the missions themselves that had their own ranching operations that had succeeded on a small scale, and so using these as a base of operations, if you will. Interestingly, the use of the Spanish word trafique, or commerce, as both noun and verb, is a modern English, in modern English, normally associated with drug, gun, or human trafficking. In fact, the Residencia, or administrative review of former Governor Barrios y Juaregui, revealed he engaged in high-stakes contraband trade between 1751 and 1759, much of it during the French and Indian War, but was not really prosecuted, and more often than not, governors were reassigned to another post elsewhere. Under the subsequent command of Governor Martos y Navarrete, officers and soldiers gifted gunpowder with Indian nations such as the Tawakani, the Iscani, Tejas, Biday, Adayas, Ais, and Nacogdoches, which foreshadowed official Spanish policy towards Indians in the following decades in the attempt to borrow the French model of trade, treaties, and toleration from Louisiana. In this drawing from José de Urrutia, who journeyed with the Marqués de Rubí during a military inspection of northern New Spain's northern frontier under the Bourbon reforms, one of the residences was designated a French trader's house in an effort to regulate trade. What is telling are the living arrangements with mostly single soldiers who would have lived inside the fort at Los Adayas. However, those who were married and had children would have resided beyond its confines in the surrounding area in relative safety in Caddo country compared to San Antonio, where intermittent warfare between the Spanish and Southern Plains Indians proved more difficult for life and trade in contested spaces. One can also see the Camino Real that traveled through Los Adayas wasn't just to Natchitoches, but other caminos or roads that went to other ranches further into the hinterlands, suggestive of graver opportunities for trade and migration. And so one of the things that I decided to do was to track the movements of the soldiers from Los Adayas through the archives. And so when I think about the post itself and being on this border, I can't help but think, I have friends and my wife's family from Laredo and family across in Nuevo Laredo, and we go across the border all the time on foot or by vehicle, mostly by foot, and you have the checkpoint there. You also have one going in like 29 miles from Laredo, and you have the border checkpoint there, and you just have the soldiers or the patrol that are there, and you imagine that, here's this place where they're just in one setting, right? And it ended up showing that the soldiers traveled a lot more than we realized to other presidios in Spanish Texas, so that they're at San Saba in the hill country, going off to hunt buffalo, and rather because it's better than doing guard duty inside the fort, and then they get captured, and then one of them's from Los Adayes, and then the indigenous Indians at the Fort Talvaya on the Red River realize, hey, this guy Antonio Treviño, he's a really tough hombre, and let's keep him alive. And then it turns out that, they realize he's from Los Adayes, and they go, oh, that figures, he's from over there in East Texas, not from San Antonio, as if to associate somebody who is different. Just as the Spanish would distinguish among different indigenous communities, the Indians could do that just as well. And so then, you have, in some cases, them going all the way even to Mexico City, as well as to New Orleans for trade. And so then, by the late 1770s, in the aftermath of the closure of Los Adayes and the East Texas missions under the new regulations of 1772, whereby King Carlos III followed many of Ruby's recommendations to reform military defenses on the frontier, Spain was more anxious about movements of the British during the American Revolution. Reports like this one from Antonio Guilibarbo, who led the return of many Adeseños to East Texas following their forced exile to San Antonio in 73, fueled Spanish suspicion of British traders among the Indians, much like the French before. Bourbon reformers' attempts at loosening the economy included lowering or ending certain taxes, but not giving up monopoly of trade entirely. Allowing legal trade in cattle to Louisiana by 1779 was one thing, especially to feed Spanish troops under General Galvez in the Mississippi Valley after Spain had joined France in alliance with the American patriot cause against England, but legalization of tobacco, alcohol, and horse trade, not so much. And getting more towards the end here, meanwhile, trade continued between Spanish Louisiana and the Indians. As indicated in this report from Athanase de Mazière, commandant at the Natchitoches Post, while Ibarbo went on to establish the villa or town of Nacogdoches in 1779 at the former mission site of the same name, and his people having lived a short time at the Bucareli settlement on the lower Trinity River. By then, the Arroyo Hondo boundary was moot following the transfer of Louisiana from France to Spain in 1762, and the Mississippi as the new boundary between New Spain and British colonies to the east. And so then on the eve of the Louisiana Purchase, you just have more trade coming in, and in this case, you start seeing other foreigners who are coming in, such as John Juan Back and Samuel Norris, to the post of Natchitoches, and the carreteros being Ruiz and Seguin. And they had to have their passports. And so all this part of trying to regulate this trade. And in this case, other products like flour, liquor, and rice, not that liquor didn't make it before, because there was illicit liquor being traded illegally from French Natchitoches by various groups of people. And so this just really continued to increase in volume. And so finally, the Arroyo Hondo border mattered, even though it was just a creek. With Spain's concern over smuggling from Louisiana, Los Adayes could not prevent the movement of peoples and goods throughout the Texas-Louisiana borderlands, as families continued to live in the region, intent upon trade for survival, whether legal or not, many of whom became the first pioneers of Nacogdoches, which then served essentially the same role as did Los Adayes, close to the border with Louisiana. Spain could not place enough boots on the ground or even ensure the allegiance of its own subjects who desired free trade, if not freedom from Spanish rule. Despite the Bourbon reforms and Spain's establishment of new military outposts in East Texas and Central Texas, the borderlands kept shifting, as did imperial and national politics, such that smuggling persisted, often in advance of the creation of any borders, and continued to flow despite enforcement afterwards. Thank you.
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Good. Everybody's still thinking about lunch.
No, thinking about the Adeseños, friends. The census records show the identity of the Adeseños held together pretty well for a number of years, and they felt themselves mistreated when they were banished to San Antonio. Did they really band together as a collective group with their own unique identity, and how did other people feel about that?
Yeah, that is a very good question, because I didn't really get to go into the ones that stayed behind in San Antonio. Eventually in San Antonio, they received lands from the secularized Mission San Antonio de Valero, and they ended up forming what's called the Pueblo de Valero, which is a town within the town, basically, if you will, which became like another barrio of San Antonio. But there was the concern about contraband trade in San Antonio after they arrived. There were some contraband cases involving tobacco. I think I alluded to it in my book. And so there was kind of like the reputation that preceded them in that regard, especially since Don Hugo Oconor, the Redbeard, was interim commandant in the late 60s. He really despised them. And so there was disagreement as to whether or not they should be allowed even to return under Antonio Guilibarbo. And the Viceroy, Bucareli, ultimately agreed. And then there's just another group. I mean, not less than half of them that stayed behind in San Antonio under Agustin Rodriguez. So I don't know why that group decided to stay and not go back. Perhaps they're like, there's no way in hell after so many people died after they were forced by the government to abandon Los Adayas. And, you had women and children dying along the way and what I refer to as a trail of sorrows. But, it created a lot of resentment by those settlers being forced to leave. And for Antonio Guilibarbo, he's like, he's going to go back one way or the other. He's going to go back to East Texas. And you have your families that are buried, your parents that are buried there. You have this kinship in Natchitoches. You have Spanish residents in Natchitoches. And so in San Antonio, then perhaps for many of the Jareños, it was fine, let them go back. But for the others who stayed, they struggled to get land for like another, almost 20 years before they got the secularized lands for Mission San Antonio de Valero. And that was the pressure put on to also secularize development, I guess, if you will. But that's a really good question, Gary, and appreciate it. Yes?
Is there much left of the ruins there at Los Adayos? Is there a cemetery?
No, oh, that's a great question when you mentioned about the cemetery, because when I mentioned cemetery, it's like I heard crickets. The chapel of Los Adayos was right next to the governor's house, and they would have mass celebrated in there all the time. The community would come and gather, and the French would visit. I would not doubt that Catos came to visit and attend mass in a kind of ecumenical way. But in terms of burials, they would have occurred inside and outside the chapel, and there's just no above ground restoration. So the whole point was that the state of Louisiana was going to do above ground restoration, but then hurricanes kept coming by and just wiping out state budgets. And the whole idea too was to have a book about the fort itself, which is what I did, much delayed, although without hurricanes as an excuse. But you have that question about cemeteries, very big, because in the surrounding area where I visited with descendants in Zawali and the Adai-Caddo, Choctaw Apache, you have all these cemeteries, and you have these churches, little churches like St. Anne's right up the road, and there's a little cemetery right next to St. Anne's Church, near where the Adai-Caddo Cultural Center is. And I looked up, and it was only like maybe 10 markers, and the last name, Flores, from like 1930s, people buried there. And I'm going, wow, like had anybody really looked into that? So I do want to spend more time in terms of those cemeteries, especially as I get to know the descendants more. Especially in terms of questions related to identity. But I think that they've kind of turned around now because there's more attention paid to the site. So you have now a museum in the one-room building that's on there. It was for a long time an archaeological lab, and they've turned it into a museum, and for the historians of sorry, I kind of pulled a Paul there. For the Louisiana historians, it's like it's got that reputation of the neutral ground, and it's like stuck there, And it's like they have a film there, and some of the Choctaw Apache that I interviewed that I spoke with that are in the film, and it's like, they're talking about Ibarbo and, these people who were here before, and I was like, yes, tell those other stories, because it wasn't just one of violence encounters, it was also peace and trade as well. They don't want to do above ground recreation of the fort on the actual archaeological site. They're thinking about maybe down the road of doing like, a reconstructed fort, perhaps maybe where the mission would have been located, and really try to kind of drive the local tourism economy. As I mentioned, the very first time I went out to Los Adayas 20 years ago, there was a big RV trailer that pulled in, huge trailer, and I was like, God, how are they going to squeeze that? Because this is like a one-lane road off the main highway, which is one lane, and off the main road, trying to maneuver it in, and the person is driving it, very carefully, and then they get out, and these two elderly couples come out, and Missouri license plates on the truck, on the RV, and I asked the gentleman, how'd you hear about this place? He says, oh, we drove into French Natchitoches at the French Fort, and they told us we should come over here and visit. And so there are multiple reasons for trying to bring about that above-ground restoration, and I just don't know if when and how that might happen. But thank you.
Thank you. We have time for about 2 more questions.
And sorry about kicking the cord here every once in a while. I kind of wake you up. I'm not doing it on purpose.
I seem to remember from your book that you said that the Franciscan Padres from Los Adayas would go and treat with the soldiers at Natchitoches. It was almost like a sentence or so. Do you know any more about that? Because I feel so sad about them sitting there in East Texas and not doing anything because there's
as I said in my book, they're not just standing there like, Padre Nuestro que estás en el cielo, and then go to the next rosary bead, they're actively out there beyond the walls, if you will, as Father Bob Bright would say about the oblate from the Oblates and talking about the Franciscans. But that's why somebody like Antonio Margil is huge, because he did help. He was a cultural broker as well for the Franciscans going over there to French Natchitoches, and as historian David Rex Galindo talks about his work about the Franciscans in a very broad, almost hemispheric sense. The Franciscans were also involved in not just converting the Indians and the missions, but in the global propagation of faith. They were in the business of salvaging souls, and that would have included over at French Natchitoches, where they lacked a resident Jesuit priest for many years. They'd come intermittently, And so the Franciscans played that role, and they would sell what are called partidas, certificates for doing the sacramental rituals of baptism, marriage, and burial. And so that was also part of, the trade that would go on. But it's more complicated too, because there is raffles and gambling going on, and forced gambling of the soldiers' wages. There was concern about some prostitution at the fort itself, because there was this one Lieutenant General Iberizu who really was a bad character. But fortunately, they must have just got rid of him, because I don't see him there. But the Franciscans, again and again and again, were involved in the sacraments in French Natchitoches. Thank you for that, because I didn't really get to talk about that Franciscan side. And they were the ones with the ranches too, so they were engaged in more than we realize.
Do you have a question? Okay.
Back there.
You mentioned the ranching, and you mentioned trading. I know around San Antonio, the missions were having a hard time to make ends meet. So one of the first things they did to trade with the natives was wool blankets, and they had thousands of head of sheep. I know from what I've read that thousands of head of sheep were also brought into East Texas. And I guess my question is, did that play a role in East Texas in trading with the natives, the blankets? Because the Native Americans saw the blankets as more durable, and they were lighter than the skins of animals.
Yeah, and I wonder exactly when that might have occurred, because I didn't see that much so by way of sheep, but you do have large livestock and small ganado at the missions, and there were actually originally 6, and 3 of them during under the inspection of General Rivera by 1730-31. 3 of those were closed, and they were brought to San Antonio. And a lot of people don't realize that they were doing ranching, and so they might have already had some of that, the sheep as well, but I didn't really see it comes up in terms of the trade or the account books. But with the other archival sources that talks about the hides, I mean, you would have had deer and buffalo and others that I think it was Governor Martos's wife in the early 1760s who made the comment that when the French came over to participate in Mass at Los Adayas in the chapel, that she was embarrassed, because she said, look at how the French dress, and then, look at us. It's like, like our people are half naked, Like, it was almost kind of like this contrast between both sides of the border. But anyhow, so it's possible that that the smaller livestock were also involved in that trade.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you, Dr. Galan.